5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The idea for Thunderbirds really came to me as a result of the German mine disaster, which happened in 1963. What happened was the mine was flooded. A lake over the top suddenly went straight down into the mine. And there were many miners trapped in air pockets, some 1,000 feet below ground. And I used to listen to the news bulletins in my car. And I would hear things like, they've managed to get a very narrow bore down to the air pocket and they've found people alive down there. But now they've got to bring up a massive boring machine so that it's big enough to pull somebody up through the borehole. But the bad news was that the machine they needed was in Bremen, and it was an 8-hour rail journey to get it to the disaster area. Some of the men were trapped under the ground for 2 or 3 weeks, and they were finally rescued. And I started thinking that really, I mean, not talking about the real world, that really there ought to be rescue dumps all over the place with all this equipment standing by for such a situation. I started thinking about a rescue organization, and as I finished one series, Lou would usually ring towards the end and say, "Gerry, can you come up tomorrow morning at 7:30 and tell me what you're going to make next?" In this particular case, I got that call from Lou rather earlier than I had expected. That night, and driving up to London to see him, I started to think, yes, a rescue organisation. But we're in science fiction, so a rescue organisation with, all these marvellous ideas and advanced machinery and so on. Obviously, there would be people who would want to get the secrets, particularly people like the Hood.
International rescue. If only I knew their secrets.
So it needs to be located in a secret place like an island in the Pacific. And by the time I got to Lou, I had the germ of the idea. He, as always, would invite me, and there would always be his silver tray and his silver pot of coffee, and he'd pour 2 cups and give me one of his huge cigars, and we would both light up. And then he would say, "Okay, Gerry, tell me all about it." And I remember on this occasion, because on the way to town I thought this is going to be hellishly expensive, I said to him, "Well, I have got an idea, Lou, but I'm not sure that you'd want to back this one." He leapt up from his desk, came round, and literally grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and dragged me into the centre of the office. And he pointed to the ceiling. I looked up and he said, "Do you see that light bulb?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Gerry, if you want to make a series about that light bulb, I'll back it." And so, of course, this gave me the confidence to tell him about international rescue, which he liked very much. And he told me to go ahead. And later, the show became Thunderbirds.
Okay, boys, that's the brief. It's our first assignment, so make it good. As you know, your uniforms are in your craft and must only be worn on call.
The Tracy brothers were named after the American astronauts that were training to go to the moon. So we had Virgil Grissom, for example, Scott Carpenter. So each one was named after an American astronaut. One of the reasons, was that to make a show for children that cost as much as Thunderbirds did, it needed to be sold extensively in America. I thought it was better that, seeing as we were making shows that had to do with space and the future of technology, I thought it was better to make what looked like American programs. After all, many American films are made over here, so I thought, well, why don't we make an American show over here? And as a result, these shows did have an acceptance in the States at a time when most British production was given the elbow.
Well, that's good.
I remember sending our art director, Bob Bell, and our special effects director to New York for a week, for no other reason than to listen to American dialogue.
A great big hello to all you earthbound pop lovers. And now to start the spinner in Little Luther and Shram Shram.
To look at the buildings, to see the American way of life, and to come back in order to make the shows acceptable in the States. We took a lot of trouble over this. I mean, for instance, our scripts were printed on American Quarto. This is the size at the time American scripts were printed on. We used American spelling, so that if one of our scripts got into American hands, they wouldn't read it and think, oh, you know, this is something written by those limeys.
Dash clever, what?
Parker was acceptable because he was a fun character.
Ain't you got my grub ready yet, Lil?
Cockney, acceptable over here. Americans thought it was hilarious.
When will international rescue start operating?
The Hood was created because he wore masks, and in America the Hood means an evil person, so it was a name that worked in England and in America, so that's how he came about. When I was in the RAF, I hasten to add, not defending my country, I was hauled in when I was conscripted. But I was stationed at Manston, and I remember one day a wing commander coming in to land in a Spitfire, and he came in with his wheels up, and as he approached the runway, the caravan at the end, the caravan controller fired a red Very light, and this pilot immediately opened up the throttle, skimmed the runway, and pulled up avoiding a crash. But that stuck in my mind, and I think it was those sort of incidents that led me to my stories. I mean, for instance, on the first episode of Thunderbirds, this had a story where an aircraft couldn't lower its undercarriage, and it was obviously going to crash eventually, until international rescue came along, of course, and rescued it and the people aboard.
Thunderbirds are go.
I was very conscious of the fact that you had to capture your audience very quickly to prevent them flipping channels. And so I thought, well, if we have a very quick trailer, kiddies will look at that and think, wow, you know, we must watch this program because all of that's going to happen. And so I produced these trailers, and because they were trailers, the cutting was very, very fast. And I think it worked. Whenever I finished the pilot or the first episode of any series, I used to take it along for Lou Gray to see. And Lou Gray had told me to make Thunderbirds as a half-an-hour show.
30 minutes, that doesn't give us much time.
I took the first one along, and we sat in the theatre, and he sat there. When the lights came up, he jumped out of his seat and he said, "That's not a television series." And I thought, what have I done? He said, "That's a feature film." He said, "Gerry, you're going to make these as an hour show." I said, but Lou, we've already filmed 9 of them. He said, well, you'll have to go back and write extra material, won't you? So I went back to the studio, and what we did was we continued to film half-hour shows whilst we wrote the very first 1-hour show. Then we put a 1-hour show on the floor, and we continued to film 1-hour shows whilst the first 9 had additional material written. And then we went back to the 1 hours, filmed all the additional material, edited it together, and we were now making 1-hour shows. Thunderbirds really had everything. Kiddies like to see destruction and jeopardy on the screen, and Thunderbirds gives them all of that, but it's about saving life and not destroying it. It was an hour-long program. It was the only one I made with puppets. It was an hour long. And so we were able to introduce characters, get the kiddies to like them, and then put them in terrible, terrible problems so that the children were anxious that they should be rescued. We had the family thing of Jeff Tracy and the boys, a bit of love interest with Tintin and Alan, and of course the fabulous machines and Barry Gray's music and just had everything going for it. It was just incredible. We held a press reception at our studio in Slough, and we put on quite a big affair. I think every journalist in town came down to the studio, and we screened the first picture for them. That evening, the London evening papers carried 2 or 3 pages on the series, and the following day, all the papers carried at least 2 pages of pictures and stories, and we all knew immediately it was going to be a big, big hit.
Well, how about that, Jeff? Some story, huh?
It sure is.
Oh, fantastic.
Everybody knew the show. Everybody bought the merchandise. All the kids were playing with Thunderbird toys. They were all dressed up in Thunderbird uniforms. You didn't have to say to yourself, I wonder whether it was going to be successful, and it was a smash hit from day one.
Boys, I think we're in business.